Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be building the A-Team van. This is a 1/25th scale model of the GMC van that was used in the TV hit series. And this kit is really hard to find, and it's really old. So as you can see, there are lots of parts that have flashing and mold lines on them. The parts are not very clean because it's such an old mold, and so it required a lot of cleanup. This model I actually bought online, and so the engine was already started, but there are so few examples of this that I purchased it anyway. I used a nail file to sand off the parts with their rough edges or mold lines, and gluing the parts together using the Revell plastic cement. Once I put the engine pieces together, I then used a black primer because I wanted to do a silver over top of it. And here is the fan also being painted. Now, I probably could have sprayed this, but I was going to do different metal colors, and so I just hand painted the silver on. So this is a silver color going over the black base. It definitely shows up better with a black base. And then some of the additional details on the engine, like for example these pulleys and wheels, I also painted silver. I used a steel color for the engine as well as the cam covers, and the steel also looks much better over a black base. Then as I continued to paint the rest of it, I did have to touch up little pieces here and there with the black as I painted over a little too much. Now I'm beginning on the chassis. So again, also some sanding required. There's a fair amount of pieces that require to be cut out because it's an old mold. Here in the wheel well is an example of some ejector pin marks that had to be sanded out, which I eventually sanded with some sandpaper as well. That was the floor pan. Here's the actual chassis, and again, just cleaning it up. Most of it you're not going to end up seeing anyway, so I just like to be thorough, and so that's why I sanded it down. Now once I glued the chassis and floor pan together, there weren't any pins to line it up, so to speak, so I lined it up as best as I could, and then used some clothespins to hold it in place, and these definitely helped to hold it quite well. I then used glue to secure the rest of the chassis in there, and these extra little pieces that had to be glued in as part of the frame. Now again, I'm using these clothespins. They're easy to put on and put off, put on and take off, and then have to sand down the remaining little pieces of the chassis. So I did find that dry fitting these things, sometimes they don't fit very well. You do have to trim them, and I use my little side nippers to do that, and then glue these in. This is the support for the transmission, and then this is the exhaust. So the exhaust did have a little hole that it went in, as you can see at the back there, and I glued this in. Now these back rear, or the rear leaf springs for the suspension, I glued them in, but I actually have to remove them later on, and you'll see why. They weren't quite adjusted to the correct dimensions, so the wheels went in the wheel well correctly. But now I'm putting the rear axle together, and then this little drive shaft piece for the front that will connect to the transmission. Now I'm gluing in the rear axle, and I had to hold it in place to make sure it didn't fall down, and then the rest of the drive shaft will then go in there. So it does have a little pin that goes in, which made it easier for it to sit there correctly. Now I did soften some of these edges with these Tamiya extra thin cement. Just melts those edges and makes them softer, gets rid of some of the lines as well as the scratches, and then the remaining portions of that rear suspension. Now we're building the front suspension here, and I had to dig out some of those holes with the scalpel there to be able to get them to fit. And then here's the subframe for the front suspension that's going on there as well. So you have to put these pieces through the subframe to hold it in place. So I was just test fitting it to make sure it was in the right place and that it would fit correctly, and then I'm gluing it in place. But this was a bit of a pain to put it all together. And here you can see the wheel hubs are supposed to be able to turn, but I ended up just gluing them in place because they did not sit properly. So here is the steering rack that's supposed to help hold them, but they did not go on well, and I really struggled to get this piece to sit where it was supposed to. And if you did actually put them where it's supposed to, the wheels had a huge discrepancy and weren't lined up. So I did end up just cutting off this one section and gluing it in place. So I used the side nippers there, and as you can see, I lined it up and finally just glued it in place because it was not working properly. Some additional little pieces to glue onto the suspension here, and then putting on the front firewall. So this is the front part of the cabin, and I initially tried to get it to line up, but those little tabs were actually in the way, and so I had to trim those off and then glue it all up again. Now here is the battery being glued in place. To be honest, I'm not sure what the purpose of all of this is, because you can't see all of it anyway when you put it together. And then this is the tunnel cover for the inside. Here's the CB radio, and then this is our dashboard that goes in place. I did initially glue this in here, but actually had to adjust it later on further back because it didn't fit in. The brake booster and other parts for the engine bay going on, and now we're on to the seats. A fair amount of trim required for these seats, and some sanding, as there's a lot of extra flash and mold lines. As you can see here, there are some ejector pin marks in the back, and I really just sanded them until they were flat. You can fill them and sand them, but I just decided to sand them. Here is the base of the seat going on, and here's the other base. And it was a little confusing because one mounts at the back of the seat, the other one mounts at the front of the seat on the floor. As you can see here, I actually mixed them up, so I had to move this one. The seat with the back mount goes on the left, and the front mount goes on the right. Don't know what the purpose of all that was. Now that these are glued in, I did add some extra Tamiya extra thin cement, and here you can see I've had to adjust the position of the dashboard backwards. Now I'm putting in the steering mechanism, and this will go attached to the steering linkage, and then there'll be the steering column that's going in right there, and that will go all the way through to the cabin, and eventually we'll put a steering wheel on it. So it didn't sit properly, and I had to glue it in place. Here is the little piece with the levers, and then finally glued on the steering wheel. And now we're on to the wheels, and the wheels are supposed to be able to turn. You're supposed to be able to put the just glue on the one side, but it was not strong at all, and so I fiddled around with this for a long time and finally just got fed up with it and glued the whole thing. But as you can see, I'm trying here to put the glue on just the one side so that it will be able to turn, but it did not work. It did not hold. It was not strong enough, and I really think it was a very poor design overall. So now I'm threading the rear axle, and this just kind of pushes together. And now I'm going to start with painting. So I'm using the Vallejo black primer, and that does a great job of covering everything. It's fairly inexpensive, and now I'm going to be spraying the interior. All of it goes black. There's not a lot of detail here, so once I'd masked that all off and it was dry, I then sprayed the seats. That's really the only thing that's going to be visible from the outside. I used a light tan color, and that came out quite nicely. And now I'm just adding some extra little details for the CB radio, some silver buttons and dials. And I did this with a brush. Later on you'll see I had to just touch up some areas with some black. These are the dials for the instrument panel, and I did that in silver. And here you can see I'm touching up some of the areas that got some overspray or weren't masked off correctly. Now here you can see I'd finally given up on these wheels, and so I just glued them in place. Now we're mounting the engine. The engine is complete. You're not going to be able to see the engine from the outside unless you're looking from underneath. And so I mounted this in place. I didn't do any wiring because you're not going to be able to see any of it from underneath. And this is quite difficult to get the engine in. It did not fit in very easily and required a fair amount of pushing and squeezing and to try and get it to go in. But once it was in, I then attached it to the drive shaft, glued it in place, and also glued the fan in place. Now we're working on the wheels. The wheels are just cut out. There are two parts to these wheels. These are the outside parts, the hub rim that you're going to be able to see. And then these are the tires. The tires were molded in vinyl, and it has this part in the middle that you have to cut out. It was very frustrating because you had to trim this extra piece, and it did look terrible at the end. Even though I try my best to be careful, you could clearly see some jagged edges. So now I'm sanding off the extra mold lines, so the wheel or the tire also looks a bit worn. We spray the wheels with black and then painted the rim in red. Initially I thought I'd use a toothpick to try and get less paint on there, but I found it didn't work quite as well as I was hoping, and ended up later on switching to a brush. So you can see the brush just to be able to get a good coverage with red paint. Also it needed two coats because the black was showing through a little too easily. I did touch up the areas in between with some black paint, and finally got the result that I was happy with. It did require a fair amount of touch-up, as I had definitely gone over in many places with that brush, but there was no real good way of doing this. So now I also added the lug nuts in silver, and this I did with the toothpick, very little paint on it, just to get the surface of those lug nuts. Once that was all dry, I then sprayed it with clear gloss and let that dry. I painted the letters on the tires. These are Goodyear tires. I did this with some white paint and almost like dry brushing. I used it on a toothpick just to get that flat surface. When that was dry, these wheels were now ready for assembly with the tires. They were then glued onto the wheel on the axle. Now the rear axles do spin, but the front do not because of all the problems we already mentioned. So I used super glue here because the parts are already painted, and it just held it so much better than regular glue. Now we're moving on to the body, and the classic A-Team van has that tail or spoiler at the back. I really didn't want to have a lot of extra glue showing, and so I used the extra thin cement. Now this model kit is just a regular GMC van, and so they added these wheel arches which you have to glue in place afterwards. And again, I'm using the extra thin cement because I didn't want to have any blobs of glue showing up. I then held it in place with these clothespins until it was dry. I did have to add some extra clothespins to the edges to make sure that they stuck down correctly. These wheel arches did not fit in properly. There was a slight lip that you were supposed to line up with the inside of the wheel well, but it just didn't sit properly, and it was quite painful to work with. But finally I got it right, and at the end then I was happy. I did use the extra thin cement again to fill in some of those creases. So now I also have to add the runner boards, and I'm doing this with the thicker glue. I really want to have a good bond here, and there's nothing for it to really hold onto except the edges, and so I glued them on and held it in place until it was at least somewhat dry. As you can see there, it did not fill the space correctly. I did have to fill the space here, this is now upside down, with some Tamiya putty. So I filled that in and let it dry. the meantime, while that's drying, there were some mold lines on the body, and I sanded these off initially with the file, and then with the rough side, and then fine side, and finally the sandpaper. Now this is dry, and we're going back to the putty and filling in some of these edges here and just wiping them to get most of it out. Now I did want to use some of this white putty here. I'm trying to get equal dimensions as best I can to get a good fill. The A-Team side mirrors aren't the usual side mirrors. And as you can see here, there are some holes in them. They're made hollow, and so I did not want to have them hollow, and so I filled in that area with this white putty. It worked really well. It's very fine putty, and so you get nice smooth edges. And I rolled off the extra and then kind of smoothed it over, and by the end then I was happy. Once those were dry, I then glued them in place. There's no hole to put them anywhere, and it did end up moving around a little bit, and I had to wipe off the extra glue, but got them to where I want them to be. Held them in place for a few minutes, and then had to wipe the extra thin cement on there to get rid of the extra thick cement. So same thing with the other side, and then the extra thin cement. And now it's time to paint the body, and so I am prepping the body with some alcohol. This is IPA, or isopropyl alcohol. It gets rid of dust and dirt, and helps get things to cling to the paper. I paint the inside first. I'm not going to do anything else with this besides painting the inside, and I did that with just the black primer. And now I'm painting the rest of the body with black primer as well, and that's because I want the main base to be black. Now there were some mold lines that I'd forgotten about on the front of the hood, but they're going to be painted a gray anyway. The AMC van does have a red stripe and then a gray, metallic gray for the top. I always thought it was black, but actually the more and more I looked at it, the more and more I realized it was actually gray. So here I am taping off the red line, and if I don't put my fingernail in there to get it to stick, there will definitely be paint that'll go underneath. It'll ruin the paint job. And so I'm using this this masking tape, which worked very well, and but as it's expensive, I use some wider, softer tape that's very easy to remove, but it covers the majority of it. Now don't forget to mask off the inside, because otherwise all the paint's going to go and ruin the black on the inside. And once that was done, I then used, this is a gloss red, Tamiya gloss red, and I started spraying the line or stripe. I'm getting a lot of overspray on the other section, which I don't care about because I'm going to spray that gray anyway. This required multiple coats of the red until finally it was thick enough that it wasn't obvious that it was on black or that there was other paint beneath. And once I had done multiple coats and let them dry, I then actually gave it a slightly different red color with gloss red. And as you can see, it's changing color as I'm spraying because it's a slightly different red, and this was a gloss red, and it came out much nicer than the other red, which was flatter. Now I am masking off the top portion here of the roof, and I'm using a little toothpick. It was actually quite a large toothpick to be able to make sure that the masking tape goes into those edges and we don't have paint bleeding. And that will allow us to keep the red. Here you can see I'm masking off the red, so that's the stripe that I'm going to keep, and everything else is going to be gray above that. It took me several times to get exactly the right place. Now there is a little line underneath from the hood, and so I cut this and allowed the masking tape to sink in underneath. So now this is the other side, again masking off with my finger to make sure I got underneath. And once that was all done and the extras are masked off, this is a metallic gray. You can really use any kind of gray that you want. And I did multiple coats of this gray. I had to get rid of the black and the red. And Once that was dry, then gave it, like I said, a second and a third coat, and was finally happy with it. So now I'm taking off the masking tape, and you can see that classic A-Team van stripe underneath, as well as the rest of the paint job. And the masking tape that I used did not take off any paint underneath, which I was very happy about. If you leave the paint or the masking tape on for too long, it definitely will pull off tape. There was a slight edge which I had to sand down. You can't sand too much because, as you see here, it's starting to have some red shifting onto the other paint, and so I had to wipe that off. We're starting with the first coat of clear. This is a gloss clear. I use the Pledge floor polish, and I want to be able to seal in that paint. As you can see here, I gave it a good thick coat after that initial wet spray, or initial mist spray. I gave it multiple coats of clear. I really wanted to be able to fill in some of the gaps, especially the edges of the paint color change, and have enough that I can then sand without bleeding through to the actual paint. So there's another coat going on, and these are really just light coats, but as you can see, even though I did light coats, it was a little too much, and I had some rundown, which was quite frustrating. So I'm using just 2000 grit sandpaper here. I don't want to get too thick or remove too much of the thickness here, so I'm sanding it down. Now I'm giving it another coat of the gloss clear, and as you can see, it's starting to be shiny and give that nice clear coat look, almost like that wet polish look, especially that front. So once I'd done that, then I sanded it. This is with the 3000 grit sandpaper, and then started to do the polish. Overall, I was happy with the clear coat, and so we're starting off here with a cutting compound, which has to be rubbed in. There's not one that you let dry and then rub off. This one you rub in, and it actually slowly polishes it as you rub it in. This is just with a microfiber cloth, and I did it with all the edges of the clear coat. Now this is the polishing compound. I use the polishing compound as the next step up after doing cutting compound, and this is supposed to make it slightly more polished, and can get rid of some slight scratches in your finish. And again, you have to rub this in, and then you wipe off. When you're done, I'm using the same microfiber cloth but a different section of it, and you can always just wash them out. Now this kit did not come with a windshield. I bought this online. The windshield was missing, and so I ended up buying a piece of PETG, and I put it over the toaster and melted it to the point where I could then form it over a surface. And as you can see here, it required a fair amount of work to get this windshield in. It was quite stiff once it had been melted and formed, but it required a fair amount of work to get the correct dimensions and then to trim it. And I very nearly cut away too much. So you can cut it with just regular scissors, but they have to be pretty strong. These are some really nice, strong and sharp scissors. But as you can see here, I have to mark off the top and the bottom, and it was really difficult to get it to work. But overall, I was happy with it, and once it was in the correct place, I could see that it was going to fit. It was nice and shiny. This is when I then glued it in. I've never worked with PETG before, so I just used the regular clear glue that I have and put it in place. It required a little bit of finger magic to get it in without falling, but managed to get it in and to sit exactly where I wanted to sit, and left that to dry. This stuff does take a little while to dry. Now once that was done, now I wanted to paint the mirrors, and this I did with just some silver paint. I also painted the side lights, and these were initially painted with just silver before. Then I was going to paint the other colors on top of it with clear paint, but I wanted to have some sort of reflective surface. While that's drying, I was putting in the side glass, again using the clear glue. I like this glue actually because, as you can see, I dropped it right in the middle of that glue, and I had to take it out, and it's very easy to wash off and wipe away. Now I'm using a different technique here, using some putty to hold it in place, and that worked much better. Here is the sunroof. That actually fit in very well. The other glass did not. But once this is in, I then glued it in using that same clear glue. This is a clear glue by Testors, and it works very well. Now, once that part was done, it was time to assemble the model, but this did not go well. It is not very well made. You have to leave the back bumper off so you can get it in, but even then I still struggled to get it in, and despite twisting and prodding and pushing and so on, I just could not get it to go in. And I realized it's because the back part of these wheel wells here, the wheel well covers, were in the way, and so I cut those off as well as part of that back bumper. And once this was cut off, it worked out much better to be able to get it in. These side nippers are very strong, and that worked well. As you can see here, at this point now, the rear is going in very easily, and once I had put the chassis on the body, I could then see that the rear wheels were not aligned with the wheel well. So I had to pull up the leaf spring suspension, and this ended up being a major ordeal to be able to get this part off because it was glued on really well. So once I had gotten this off, I then had to do different things to measure it to find out where it was supposed to sit so that it wouldn't be towards the front. And as you can see here, I had to pull off the leaf suspension, and it was going to sit further forward than it was originally. Once I gotten that measured out and glued it all in place before it set, I then re-glued the rear axle in and lined everything up so that I was happy with the rear axle position and that the wheels were going to be centered. So that worked out much better, and then I reattached the drive shaft. Now we're on the radiator, and I glue this radiator, and you can see I actually had to rotate this. I put that on incorrectly, and once that was dry, I then used the extra thin cement just to reinforce that. Now I'm painted it with the Vallejo black primer, and then painted the inside with some silver, and that showed off very nicely, although you will not be able to see it in the final model because it is covered. So painting this silver over black gives you a much better effect rather than silver over gray or white. Attempted to install the weight radiator here, and the radiator was quite difficult. There weren't any really good holes for it to sit in. Now there's the front grille, and this is a special molding for the A-Team van. I painted it with the black primer and then painted silver on the lights, and that gave a nice reflective coating. And I used a brush for this. I didn't mask it off and spray it. The brush did well enough, and by the end of that I was then happy. You can see how I rotated around to use my hand as I'm right-handed, and I can get the other side and edges of this. Now once that was dry, I then used the gloss clear coat, the same floor polish, and then I also added some extra nail polish to get some shiny effect there of the lights. Now I'm gluing the lower lights, the fog lights, which I've painted in orange, and I'm using super glue for this as it'll hold much better. Then push it into place using my little tweezers here. Same thing with the one on the right hand side. Now once that was all dry, I then used super glue to glue it to the front of the van. There wasn't really a good fit and no little lips or holes to put it into. Now for the last part here, I'm going to be gluing in the model so it doesn't fall out very easily, just using the super glue, giving a large amount there. I paint the rear lights with silver. They do give you some red clear lights to glue in the back there, but I want to make them a bit more obvious. Now while I have the silver out, I gave another coating here to the mirrors. As you can see, we've got the black GMC that needs to be red, so I'm just touching this up with a little brush and some red paint. And it would be nice if they had a decal for that, but I didn't get any decals with this kit either. Now there's the rear bumper. that I sprayed with black and then clear, and then glue this into place. This did have some little holes for it to go into, and that worked quite well. You have to do this after you put the chassis in. Now we do have this bumper bar in the front, and sprayed that with black, then painted the front lights, these little spotlights, with silver, and that gave a nice effect for these lights. They do have little holes in them, probably from the molding process, but just painted them, and then sprayed it with gloss clear, and then the same thing with the nail polish. I'm using super glue here to glue it into place because everything is painted. The regular glue won't hold it, and once I lined that up, I then held it into place. Now these windshield wipers are not great. They are the wrong angle, and so as you can see I'm using some glue to soften them up and then correct the angle. Now I do have the red lights going on here. I use that clear glue, which worked very well because it does dry. Even though it looks white, it dries clear. Now here is the sun visor area, which I sprayed with black, but it had some dust in it, and once that was done and sanded, I then used the same gray to paint this because it sits on top. Same thing with the clear coat, multiple coats of clear, and then super glue over the top of it. I dry fit it multiple times before putting the glue on to make sure it was going to go in the right place. And here it is going on. I'm now also gluing on these windshield wipers. They are a little fiddly and required a fair amount of caressing to get into the right place. Now next we have all these lights, these spotlights, and I painted them with the same black paint, and then painted the inside or front with silver, and then clear coated them all. Now once it was clear coated, I used the clear orange from Tamiya, and that was dried. I then touched them all up with some clear gloss nail polish. So the original van has two of these lights at the top are the orange color, and as you can see I'm putting those in the middle and using the super glue to hold them in place. You do have to adjust the position because they don't sit well. The design just wasn't that great, I guess, back in the day. Now I'm painting the rear lights red and the front lights orange. There are no decals for this, but I definitely wanted to have these added details. Once that was all dry, I then put on some polish. That's just regular car polish that I use, and once that was dry, I then buffed it off, and it came out looking nice and shiny, and was very happy with that result in the end. Did have to go all the way around. It's difficult to get in some of those little areas, but using that microfiber cloth definitely does help. You can also polish the glass, and that'll make it shiny as well. Now, the polishing process, I like to use the cutting compound first, followed by the polishing compound, followed by regular car polish. It doesn't take long for each of those steps. Now the van did have some of these antennae, so I sprayed them black and then used super glue to mount them. Be very careful when you're mounting these, because if you drop them, you get glue somewhere else, it's going to ruin your finish. So you can also drill a hole if you want to, but I just used super glue in this situation, make sure that they are all lined up and were vertical. And then I'd forgotten that the side pieces of glass here did have a piece of metal bar, and so I did paint them with that same gray color. Probably should have painted it black first to get that extra sort of dark appearance, but it ended up showing off that side bar in the end. So here's the finished model, and enjoy.